So one of the intriguing ones that I'm looking forward to early in the year is this possible summit that Joe Biden talked about. He talked about having a summit of world leaders within his first 100 days in office on climate change. The US has a heck of a lot of diplomatic and economic power. And if they do something that's really strong, that could really set the tone globally for how governments are thinking about the year in climate change. Another particularly interesting one, if assuming it happens in June when it's scheduled, is the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which is scheduled to be in Rwanda. That is a unique meeting, really, in that it brings together the heads of state and government across 70 or 80 countries that span some of the most developed in the world, such as the UK, including some of those that are not very progressive on climate change, such as Australia, with some of the poorest in the world. And it's a real kind of dialogue between the poorest and most vulnerable countries in the world and some of the ones that have the real economic clout. The G7 and G20, not a vast amount happened during 2020. Saudi had the chairmanship of the G20, which means they obviously didn't, they're not one of the most progressive countries on climate change. The US had the G7 presidency, which really meant nothing happened at all. In 2021, you're looking at Italy and UK in the chairs. So what will they do? In particular, those two organizations, the G7 and G20, are ones that you would expect to be involved in discussions of how the world builds back economically after the COVID pandemic. They're also the two that are running COP26 in the climate change field. So how can they bring these two things together and persuade basically money into economic rebuilding, which is also beneficial on climate change? China is due to host the other big UN summit this year, the Convention on Biological Diversity, scheduled for May, highly likely to be postponed. Assuming that happens, how will China play this with a net zero climate pledge on the table? How will that change its diplomatic stance? China has an awful lot of convening power if it chooses to use it, and an awful lot of economic power, particularly with some of the sort of poorer but more resource-rich nations. UN General Assembly in September. How is that going to bring in climate change? Is it going to link it to biodiversity? How will that link into the rebuilding back after COVID and efforts to support some of the most vulnerable economies? And then finally, COP26, scheduled in November in Glasgow. So there's a huge amount to look forward to. We really have a window of opportunity, I think, in 2021 and the following years for a number of reasons, most specifically the sort of changed geopolitics and the changed economics, to actually start getting a solution in place to climate change. And that's not a situation that we could have talked about a year ago. Things really have changed that rapidly in such an exciting direction.